one of our chants that we do sometimes is "Tell me what democracy looks like."
This is what democracy looks like.
Thank you. And I would like to ask you, Ben, how you think, just following on from what Amy said, how you think we can reinvigorate and reform our democracy in this country when we, yes, that's essentially the question. How can we go about reinvigorating and reforming our democracy from a Westminster point of view, from an Exeter point of view, from a big business point of view, from all points of view?
Well, we could spend the rest of the time I've got with you talking about that, which might be a useful thing to do. I mean, my view as somebody who, and I can't remember who it was, Churchill ever said that, the democratic system is the worst possible system except all the others, is that, in the end, and I think someone mentioned this earlier, when you're having your assemblies, reaching decisions by consensus, is a different matter from how you're deciding policy on the basis, well, not on the basis of even a city, let alone a country. And if I look around the world at different political systems that have been built up, I don't think there's anywhere that's perfect. I have my ideas of countries that I think do better than us. I think the Scandinavian countries have been more successful. But in the end, as someone who came into politics because I wanted to achieve change, my very firm view is that, and that's why I'm going from this meeting off to campaign for the local elections in May, is that we do that using the structures and systems that we have. Now, if the Occupy movement can feed into that or influence that, I think that's a very positive thing. In the end, in the absence of a revolution, though that's the structure that will deliver the change that I want to see, and I would imagine you want to see. And I think there are lots and lots of ways you can reinvigorate democracy. And as you probably know, I'm a long-term supporter of electoral reform. I fought very hard for electoral reform in the recent referendum, which sadly was defeated. I'd like to, the Labour government introduced citizenship into schools to give, because one of the things that strikes me when I go around schools in Exeter is how little young people understand about how the political system works and how they could get involved themselves in achieving change, whether in their local communities or more broadly. So, I mean, I don't want to go on too long because I'll get one of you doing whatever the movement is.
No, we won't do that.
We might.
But I mean, just as an introduction, I think that's a sort of summary of where I'm coming from on that point, really.
Correct point. We use a different type of democracy. It's called consensus, and it doesn't work the way that you understand in parliamentary representative democracy. And so that's probably part of the reason that you may not understand this movement very well. It's I would encourage you to come down here more and more often and be part of it, so you may actually start to get a feel for what it's about. For me, this is a cauldron. This is an experiment in a new type of democracy, and we don't have everything right. We don't have everything. We have lots of things right. We have lots of things wrong. But we're experimenting through, and we're making experiments, and we're trying to find our way through the morass. It's the morass for us, or I speak personally, is parliament representative democracy, because it's actually delivered nothing. It's taken us to the tipping point where the environment is tipping over into destruction. It's taken us to economic destruction, and it's taken us politically where politicians don't know what to do about the economic destruction or the environmental destruction. So that's my opinion.
I think I do understand how the democracy that you here works. The point I'm making is that if you're talking about managing even cities the size of Exeter, or let alone countries, working by consensus would bring huge challenges, because I mean you I'm sure you have different views here about things, but basically you're a group of people who have similar concerns about big issues, but there are a lot of people out there who vote Tory, who vote BNP, and so if you were going to try to run a country through consensus, no decision would ever be made if you're going to require that.
That's exactly what we've got now.
Everybody agrees that, because someone who doesn't agree with you would veto it. That's why we have representative democracy in elections.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, like Bruce said, you don't get many positive decisions now anyway. Now, if there's a problem with the way that consensus works, there's also a problem with the way that the whole government system is structured, or maybe the state system in itself. Now, you brought up the Churchill quote that democracy is the best system except for is the worst system except for everything else. That's the same Churchill who said that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Now, that suggests something again. That suggests something about how people in this country are educated about their own democracy. And that's something that we at Occupy try to do, is not only to try and create a better democratic process, but also to inform people about, many issues, political issues, social issues, economic, things about how the government works, how the government functions. And that's something that we've achieved very well in Occupy, because I've seen quite a few people come in and out and suddenly have a lot more knowledge than they had before. And I think, there has to be conversation about other ways to structure society, or to structure states in the first place, if, a more democratic system will not work at the state level.
I think there's been really quite a groundswell of disillusionment then with what you could call the political establishment, because it's seen as only supporting the super rich, really. This is a perception. I mean, obviously, on an individual level, I dare say there's really a lot of work, good work going on, but the perception is that banks keep on getting bailed out, and meanwhile there are lots of cuts being implemented by the government to public services and so on. You've got the NHS threatened and so on. And the perception is that the Labour Party is not being very strident in opposing all of those measures, and
to be able to make effective decisions that are implementable based on consensus. I just pose that question, really.
Well, I'm sure 300 years ago you could probably ask the question, well, is it realistic to hope for the abolition of slavery? And perhaps at that point it wasn't. I'm not saying that we're going the next 5 years, 2 years, 10 years, or even 30 years that we're going to have, I don't know, national or world government system based on consensus or whatever, but you can start from anywhere on the political system, and there's always work you can do, and a lot of it needs to be done, and it's pretty urgent considering, I mean, just to take two issues that are of mortal importance to the human race. We have global warming and environmental catastrophe and nuclear proliferation, and you have the most powerful country in the world that's a democracy, and yet, just to give an example, in the 80s, so it says, but in the 80s, for example, it just gave nuclear weapons, or it helped Pakistan getting nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a criminally insane thing to do. I don't know what Britain does with, I don't think Britain's so bad with nuclear weapons around the world, but I mean, those are just two issues that are just so important but don't seem to be grasped sufficiently. We had the failing at Durban recently with the climate change conference. It was a failure. It was a total failure. And practically everyone on the planet would probably put survival of the human race above practically any issue. But it doesn't seem to be necessarily the case with some politicians, or the political system as a whole.
Yeah, I'm just taking us somewhere slightly different, but I mean, kind of related. I mean, I think Eamon's made some great points. I just, going back to the question of democracy, and I think for me there's a question of power, which is really important, and where does the power lie within our society? Now, if you were to look at, I mean, I'd be interested to know, what people think, or I'd be interested to know what you think. If you look at our society and you look at what proportion, what percentage of the power in our society, the influence in our society, is held by the government, or no, not the government, call it Parliament. Okay, say Parliament. Within the UK, what proportion of the power do they hold? What proportion of the power is held by us, the people, and what proportion of the power is held by big business?
Corporations.
How, kind of in terms of percentages, how would you see that then?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I could put a percentage on it, but I do think that you're onto something if you are suggesting that I think one of the, or let me put it like this, one of the things that I think people are frustrated about and worried about is the apparent inability of politics to deal with some of these big global issues. I mean, you talked about global warming. I would throw into that the power of the markets, the supranational power of the markets. However, you know, when I ask myself, well, how do we address that? How do we address that problem? I'm not sure that. I mean, I think the Occupy movement has a role in terms of raising consciousness, but in the end, I mean, Gordon Brown's written a very interesting book about this, and I think rather important book, that if we're to tackle it properly, if we're going to restore people's faith in the ability of politics to represent them and achieve change, then this has to be done on an a bit like climate change, has to be tackled on an international basis. There's no other way of doing it. It's no good if one country, you know, does it and no one else does. Exactly the same when it comes to international financial regulation. I think if there's one big challenge on that side that the world faces, that is building a robust framework for international financial regulation, which we don't currently have, and in the absence of that, that does render individual politicians in individual countries much less, the Germans would say handlungsfähig, much less able to control events in their countries than they have been in the past. I think that's a very important and very fundamental question.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is a totally international world, and things will have to be changed internationally. But also gives us a great challenge because we. But I mean, you know, let's say countries like Venezuela and places like that who are doing the Mother Earth positions. Where they, you know, they plead for the Mother Earth and then they're against the. It only takes 2 or 3 people to get together into a union, into a combination of people, and then things spread. You know, painting this picture that we can't do anything because we're all isolated is actually quite bleak and despotic.
No, I wasn't suggesting we can't do anything because we're isolated. I'm just saying that I think to affect meaningful change, whether on climate change, the big environmental challenges that we face, or building an effective international framework for regulating financial services, I think that in my view, that will only be done effectively internationally, because countries acting unilaterally will be a pinprick on climate change. That's why international agreements are so important.